Hello, and welcome to Surprising Factors in Fostering Success in Advanced Learners. My name is Stacy Johnson. I am the CTY Marketing Coordinator at the Johns Hopkins University Center for Talented Youth. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Amy Shelton, Executive Director at CTY. Dr. Shelton holds a faculty appointment in the School of Education and has held joint appointments at the School of Medicine and Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. She's also served on the University Steering Committee for the Science Learning Institute. Amy is an advocate for bright students in every community and has dedicated her research to the design and delivery of innovative educational models and approaches that support the diverse community of advanced learners. Amy, welcome, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stacy. I'm actually really excited to be here. So good evening, good morning, or good afternoon, depending on your current location. I'm really delighted to have you here because in this webinar, I hope to share some insights and thoughts on factors that we know impact students' school achievement, their college and career readiness, sort of all those packaged things that we're looking for in our children. And many of these are ones that parents and even educators sometimes find surprising. So for some of you, some of this may be familiar. So for some of these may be sort of new, or they may just validate things that maybe you were suspicious about. And so with that, I want to talk a little bit about just what are these things that help us think about our students. And so tonight we're going to focus heavily on advanced learners because that is our space. And we assume you've come to us because you very likely have a student who is in that high end of learning ability. But much of what I'm going to talk about would be true for pretty much anyone who's looking to advance in school. However, many of these things, the way I talk about them will be because we have these students who have this really high capability. So I always like to start with a little bit of perspective about what this is going to be and what it's not going to be, because whenever you start talking about college and career success, certainly brains go to college admissions, which is often a very hot topic, and we're finding a hot topic at younger and younger ages. So what this seminar is not about is it's not going to be college admissions 101. You can get that in lots and lots of places. It's also not going to be a checklist for academic success because what you're going to hear me say over and over again as we move through this is that there isn't really a checklist. There are things that we do that promote success, but there's not sort of a set way that everyone needs to operate. What this webinar is going to be about is an informed discussion of factors that are beyond academics that we know promote success. I hope it'll be a little bit of guidance on supporting your student as a whole child, because we know that that is a major part of success in school as well beyond. And I hope that the whole tone of it will be a little bit of a reminder to kind of keep calm and enjoy the journey. And the other piece of it that I want to sort of lay down as a framework is that as parents and educators, we often confuse the needs of a child with the things that we sort of have in our head that we want. So there may be moments throughout this webinar in which I say some things that might sound like they're contradictory to sort of what you're feeling. And that's because oftentimes while child needs and parent and guardian wants do align, there are times when they do not. And we're going to sort of highlight a few of those in here. So with that, I want to suggest that as parents or caregivers, we often have sort of what I consider commitments to our children. And these are the general ones that I always say. I always tell my son, I'm going to keep you safe, healthy, and happy in that order. We take the education version of that. So, and I've added educators in there. What I want you to take away from the discussion tonight is that as a parent, a caregiver, or an educator, the goal is a little bit different. And the way I characterize it, I will help you stay engaged in school, build your authentic story. We're going to talk a lot about that, and learn to advocate for yourself. And I really want to note that I use the word, I will help you do these things. That's going to be a critical piece in much of what we talk about tonight. Is less about I will do things for you and more about how I will help you do them. So I'm going to start just briefly with a reminder of engagement for people. So we've actually done past webinars. If you've been able to attend those, you may have heard us talk a lot about things that are engaging. And tonight, that is still sort of front and center in many ways. But I'm not going to talk a lot about school engagement. I'm going to talk about other factors. This is just a reminder that it's easy to think that an advanced learner is inherently going to be interested and engaged. And the reality is that often they are not. And that's because when we think about what a student has in this sort of complicated image here, there are strengths, there are weaknesses, and there are what we call passions. That doesn't necessarily have to be sort of at the height of things, but just what are the things that grab a child's interest? And it's this space where we can understand kind of what it is we need to foster, where we might need to improve engagement. And for those who might be interested, I've got the QR code here for one of our previous webinars in which we did talk quite a bit about some of the tools for assisting with that school engagement. Some of the things we'll talk about tonight also will promote engagement, but it's less directly related to those tools. So in thinking about this whole notion of school achievement and college admissions and career success, where do we start? Well, oftentimes when I start talking to parents or to other educators, I get this question, will my child be competitive for college? And I start there with this because that's actually not what I'm going to talk much about. All of the things I'm going to talk about should drive being competitive for college, but there's an awful lot of myths out there. And what I would like to say about college admissions in general is that it is a moving target, meaning that if you're seeking advice for, say, your middle school student or your early high school student, much of the advice out there is sort of how to game the system, but that system constantly changes. And so rather than thinking about how to game the system, we often talk instead about just what are some of the more authentic and meaningful things you can do. So I've got some links here because there are many, many sources out there on the college admissions myths. And I highlight those because that's what I mean when I say it's a moving target. And a lot of the things that people think are critical to college applications may or may not be. And in fact, many of them are really, truly not, including sort of a long checklist of activities. So the upshot is that you're going to hear me reference checklists and checklist approaches. And what I would like to argue is if you want your child to really be successful, it is not useful to think about a long checklist of activities or things that every child must have. It is true that for college admissions and other things like good grades are helpful and good test scores can be helpful unless you're doing test optional. But in general, there's not some long list of things that you must just make sure your child does. So what I would argue is that this is actually the wrong question. We're not going to ask, will my child be competitive for college? The question that we should be asking is really, how can I foster my child's growth and learning? Because when it comes down to it, if you want a child to be successful, that is what you need to promote first and foremost. And to do that, I'm going to wrap this up in a sort of the broad scope of saying what you have to do is you have to help children build an authentic story. And I'm going to explain what that is. And then I'm also going to talk about some of the ways in which you do that. And we'll go through each of these individually. So I'm going to start with, what does it mean to build an authentic story? And what it means is that for each of us as a person, if we reflect on sort of where we are in our journey, whether it's our career journey, our family journey, what I really consider the life journey that's got all those components, we can tell a story about who we are. And when we think about what we need to help our children do, and if you're an educator, what our students do, we need to focus on that notion of authentic. And for me, that means several things that aren't always easy for me to internalize as a parent in particular. First is that to have an authentic story, you have to accept that it cannot be dictated. So you cannot do it for them. It's going to have to happen organically over time. It can't be contrived. It's not static. So, I mean, the purpose of the whole point of it being authentic is that it has to truly be the story of who a child is. It emerges through reflection. And what I mean by that is that it's not simply a catalog of things that are happening to a student or things that they do in sort of just, rote diary form. It's actually about reflecting on how life changes and how, as a person, your experiences have shaped you. It's different for every student. So there's no single version, no one thing that everyone says, oh, what should be there in a life story. We're all very different and we have different experiences. Moreover, we reflect on those experiences differently. And there's another aspect of it being different, and that is that the story is different over time. And what I mean there is that the same story retold will change a little bit based on the lens at the time of retelling. And the best example of this would be that if I were to tell you today about my academic journey, it would probably sound different and have different insights and reflections than that same academic journey when I described it, say, in my own college admissions essays or when I was in graduate school. And so that the purpose of that is to say that these stories are ever changing. And at any given time, telling that story, the key is that it be your authentic self in that moment. So the good news is that if you support your child to grow and learn, if you really focus on that whole notion of growing and learning and less about what are all the check boxes I have to tick, they will have an authentic story to tell because that is where it comes from. It comes from growth and learning. So let's talk a little bit about the different elements that kind of go into that. So this is where I think people say, or, what do I need to do to really promote my child? And some of these overlap with some of the tools we talk about just in general for how to sustain an advanced learner, because that is what we're talking about. We're talking about ways to be successful. And the first one is the critical one is making time for discovery. And what this references is helping children find the things that they love to do. To do that, you have to think about ways to offer discovery. So, how do you create opportunities? How do you help them sample different activities? How do you think about where are they going to find their interests, their passions, those things that they really want to spend their time on? And I would argue that when we talk about advanced learners, we often have a tendency to kind of slip into thinking that these are all academic opportunities that we want to explore. But really, children need chances to do experiences, both academic and beyond. So I would include sports, music, hobbies. And these can vary in the degree to which they feel academic. So, for example, a child interested in rocketry, that has kind of an academic feel, but it's also a hobby that has other elements. Something like sports and music, which also have their own kind of academic pieces, can also be ways of spurring interests. So, for example, the number of athletes that get interested in aspects of physics because of something they're doing, or same thing with musicians. Many musicians find themselves gravitating to elements of mathematics and other fields. So these are those things that we know are sort of enriching in life in general, but they also do have an interplay with academics. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that if you can allow those experiences, you'll find that a student may gravitate largely to more academic activities, but may round that out with these other things as well. And you won't know that unless the opportunities are given to them. Part of discovery, though, is not just about finding what you like. It's also about finding out what you don't like. And this is critical as well, because there's an importance to trying things that may not stick, because we don't always know what's going to interest a child. In fact, I would say we don't always know what's going to interest ourselves. We often have to try things as well to know what we like. And so we need to really encourage kids to take chances. So part of this discovery is actually thinking that way. And an example of this is at CTY for years back prior to the pandemic, we ran a student research program. And so this is a small program where students could come and do research at Hopkins here, working with a lab and completing a small project each summer. And at the end of one of our sessions, this spectacular student did a wonderful project. And I was talking to her about her project. And I always like to ask, what was the most important thing that you learned this summer? And her answer to me was, I learned I don't want to do research. And a colleague said, oh no, the program has turned this student off from research. But in talking with her, that's not what happened. What happened is she had never done research. She got in that situation and realized that this was not really the kind of thing she wanted to do. Not everyone is cut out to do research. Not everyone should do research. And so I actually took it as a victory because we actually helped the student figure out something that she may not necessarily want to pursue. Now, it's always possible that, over time, other exposure, maybe she gravitates back to research. But in that moment, it helped her think about other things she wanted to try. I felt very similar for myself. I used to want to go to med school, and then I became a certified nursing assistant and realized that is not what I liked about medicine. The other thing that comes along with finding out what you don't like is helping to teach what I call the bounds of commitment. And what this means is that you need to find a balance between helping a student or a child see when they need to see out a commitment. So when are they committed to something that really does need to be seen to fruition? Versus when do you need to know that it's okay to let a child walk away? And so just as another example, I used to run a destination imagination team. If people know, that's problem solving, like Odyssey of Mind. And I had a child in my group who was spectacular, really good at the problem solving, did great job on all of our challenges. However, he was miserable. He didn't want to be there. He actually said he would rather be in the regular aftercare than coming to Destination Imagination. It was just not interesting to him. And his parents at the time said, well, he was going to stick it out because he had committed to it. And I found myself finding that a little perplexing. And so I actually told the parents, well, actually, right now, it's not bad to walk away. We still have time if we wanted to get another student in, we could replace. We don't actually need more kids on the team, that we have enough without this child. And so convincing the parents that this was okay for their child to walk away, they kept saying, well, no, he committed, he committed. But what I really found out was that they really felt it was something that was good for him and they wanted him to do it. So even though he was miserable, they felt it was something he should do. So the other part of bounds of commitment is that as a parent or an educator, you have to make peace with not with child not wanting the things that you think they should do or maybe you enjoy. And that can be a tough lesson because oftentimes we do think we know. But putting a child in a situation where they're miserable, unless it's really truly a requirement that they've got to get done, that's not particularly helpful. So I would actually point out that when we talk about discovery and learning, it's called trial and error for a good reason, which means some things will not stick. And this whole notion of both finding what you like and what you don't like is an important piece of it. The next step is thinking about how to help students dig deep into their interests. And I mention this because so often when we talk about things like college admissions, people talk about sort of all the things they want to show that they're able to do. But if you look into the literature on college admissions and talk to college admissions officers, oftentimes they're actually looking for really understanding what a child is interested in. And so particularly for advanced learners where this is already their sort of interest is to dig deep, having the opportunity to do that is important. And this is contrasted with that notion of checklists. So again, there's sort of this belief out there that there's this long checklist of activities that I have to show. It includes things like, oh, they've got to show so much volunteer and they've got to be in this many clubs and this many extracurriculars. And really, that's not terribly helpful if you're thinking about the authentic story, because it makes it hard to understand who your child is becoming if it really is just a bunch of things that they do. And it also makes it challenging to demonstrate that depth and interest. And if there's one thing that I've seen in working with college advising is that depth and interest is often what carries the story really well. Being able to show there are some things out there that you've really been able to dive into. And so it's really on us as parents to think about what grabs your child's interest the most and help encourage them then to explore those things more deeply. And I kind of view it as you're kind of helping them become a mini expert. And that can be done in lots of ways through at-home activities, looking very closely for opportunities that either align with or build upon things you know that your child is already interested in. So you can do a little bit of discovery there as well. And then another piece that I think is often missed in giving advice on these things is it's also useful to reflect with them on what they like about their interests. So I was talking to two now college students, but were high school students at the time, who were growing hot peppers. They both liked hot sauce and they were growing hot peppers. And it was interesting because when I started talking to the two of them about why grow them, like, why do you want to do this? They had two very different motivations. One of them was very interested in the agriculture of it, very interested in like what does the genetics of these different kinds and figuring out how you might do it so that you don't get any cross-pollination, very much the agricultural side. The other child was actually really interested more in sort of the mechanics of it. What does it take to dry the seeds? How long do they have to dry? What's the business model you would have if you wanted to actually sell these things? And what were some of the regulations? So two very different motives for what looked to be a common interest. And that gave me a lot of insights into what these two individuals, what their life story was more like, what that authentic story was building to be for them. And then the other thing about digging deep into interests is that they will sometimes change over time. That is, a child who might be interested in trains as a young child may always kind of be interested in trains, but may develop into other areas instead, related or otherwise. So it's recognizing that you can dig deep into something and really know it, and that can be part of the story, but it may or may not be the thing that ultimately is the primary interest. So the boys with their peppers, I don't know if that will remain something that they are interested in a lifelong sense, but it's definitely something they are able to talk about because of the depth in which they got into it. The next area is one that we talk about in a lot of our webinars in different forms. And this is to encourage risk taking and provide opportunity to fail. Now, when we did our previous webinars, we often talk about allowing or permitting failure, and that's still true. But in this version, it's also really creating opportunities to fail. And that might sound kind of contradictory. We don't want our kids to fail. But it turns out that when you're trying new things, so in that discovery phase and that digging into interests, it is a way to find new strengths and interests, but it's also a place for trying things at which your student might not excel, either at first or even ever, because there's a lot of value to providing opportunity to fail. And this comes from a lot of different places. For the purpose of tonight, when we think about storytelling, about sort of really building that authentic story, stories from failure often highlight strengths. Things like how did you get through it? What was the perseverance like? What kind of problem solving did you have to do to overcome whatever the challenge was? So, really reflecting on a challenge that has resulted in a failure, large or small, is an opportunity for growth. Along that same lines, everyone faces failure at some point. It's just a fact of life that at some point, something is not going to go well. And if we have early opportunities to experience those kinds of things, that's what's going to build the skills to deal with them later on. And one thing about childhood and schooling is that we can actually create safe spaces for that kind of failure with low stakes opportunities. So I had a colleague who had an advanced learner who was very, very, very anxious about getting anything wrong in an academic realm. So rather than challenge the student fully only in the academic realm, the student was given an opportunity to go to a dance camp and was not very good at it. But that was okay because that was an opportunity to see something that she wasn't particularly good at and that she could learn from kind of not being able to do that. There are other opportunities where failure itself is part of the process. So C2A classes are notorious for really having trial and error built into them, meaning that you are not expected to do things right the first time. And in fact, there's not a whole lot of learning that goes on if you do. So this idea of failure is often when people always say, can't you use a different word? Because that's really what it is. It is. But it's the key to it is it's not a bad thing. It's a learning thing. And the other concern is that there's a danger if you're not exposed to some forms of failure, meaning if you never experience them, there's a risk of what I call the crash and burn later. And the best way to characterize this is that for advanced learners in particular, they can go through school, they're challenged perhaps depending on the school they're in, or if they do CTY or they do some other programming, but generally they're pretty successful. And oftentimes for these students, the first time they are unsuccessful comes fairly late, can be as late as graduate school or even in career. And when that is the first time an individual has to really face that kind of difficulty, you actually do see severe problems with the way they are able to handle it. So a lack of skills in that realm. And then also failure is in good company. So I've got three people right here on the screen. I grew up in Chicago, so Jordan is a big part of my life. But here are three people who I think we would all consider very successful in their respective careers, all of whom have a story about a pretty strong failure. And not just at the start of their career. If anyone is old enough out there to recall, Michael Jordan also left basketball to try baseball, where I think most of us would argue he actually failed. So failure is in good company. It's something that we actually should embrace. And the key is that we always talk about permission to fail. Now I'm talking about opportunity to fail. And the key is, but you do not get permission or opportunity to give up. You always embrace it and stand back up. The next area is one that's very near and dear to my heart. I could do a whole lesson on that. It's playtime, the power of play. And in many of my talks that I do for teachers and for parents, I talk a lot about educational play. And educational play really refers to those things that have sort of a learning and academic feel, like games and puzzles, blocks, books, playing imaginative play with everyday objects, all of those things that sort of we do in a daily life. And it is often the case that we can tie certain types of play to certain types of educational experiences. And that has been shown to be valuable. But the thing that has been shown to be extremely valuable in student success that we often don't talk about is the role of unstructured play. And this really refers to free time. In school, we're talking about recess. We're talking about that time when kids get to just kind of go run around and do what they're going to do. And there's many views on this, but the prevailing one is that this is the way children and even adults explore their world. So oftentimes we tend to break it up into, oh, well, they're learning or they're playing. And the reality is it's not about learning or playing. It's about, is it structured or, and or formal learning, or is it unstructured around here? They are learning about cooperation. They are learning about taking turns, sort of the social skills. They are also inherently learning about aspects of physics and other elements in life. And there's been extensive work on issues around play and recess, depending on the particular studies, that have shown that these are not only opportunities for kids to sort of let off steam, but they are actually learning opportunities and an important part of success for many children. And so this is just to say that we often think of play as an alternative to learning and to school and to those other things. It's not. It's part of the story, and learning is happening all the time. So the other element to play is that it's also an opportunity for you as an adult in the space to think about some of those other elements we talked about finding interest, about helping with discovery. Because when children are playing, they're often providing clues to their interests. So listen for their questions, listen for clues to their interests, because oftentimes they're revealed in those unexpected moments. The next area is one that's also near and dear to CTY's heart, something that we view as one of our strengths, and that is the importance of peer community and support. I cannot emphasize enough that there is a wealth of literature out there about the importance of support for students from families, from parents, but also from peers. And among advanced learners in particular, it seems to have a specific benefit. And that largely comes from the fact that students, when they're interacting with peers, they get that social support. That is, they build a support network. But it's also a way of getting validation. So when you're around other people who share your interests, it's a way of validating your interests. And for someone who's an advanced learner in particular, it can be a validation of that, I'm the smart kid in school. That can be in certain settings kind of uncomfortable. But when you're around other kids for whom that's the same, that's very validating for them. And the other piece of this that relates to some of the things we're talking about today that goes beyond kind of the simple supports is that peers are also a place where you get the inspiration for new interests. And I was talking to some CTY now recent alums, and one young man who said I could refer to him as ATR. Actually made a comment about how different some of these kids were. And this was a group of kids who had been CTY alums and were now getting ready to go off to college and going to all different places with all different majors. And he commented that about their community breaking up in some ways because they were moving apart. But what caught my ear was he said, well, what we have in common brings us together as a community. But learning how we are also different opens up our worlds. And he was really referencing the different things that he had learned from being around people who shared with him that commonality of being this advanced learner. And in this case, it was a group from a very STEM-oriented group, but also highlighting how he had developed new interests as a result of being around these people who were common and in community, but also had differences. And I thought that was very inspiring in and of itself. And then the other piece of peer community in this case is that peer groups may differ for different elements of a child's authentic self, meaning that it's okay to have friends that are aligned with, say, your interest in school and other friends which may or may not overlap because you also play a sport or are in the band. There are many ways that kids can have peer groups, and each of those is actually important for that sort of development of your authentic story. Now, when we talk about peer community, there is another element that I think would be remiss not to talk about, because we do hear this, and we certainly hear this at CTY, which is, but my child has trouble making friends. And that is a reality for kids, not just in advanced learners, but there are simply children who have this difficulty, often because they are, certain social and emotional traits. We have a whole spectrum of different traits that we share. And for some people it's easier and some people it's more difficult. And I delved into literature just a little bit about how people really address this, because this is something that I think many of us face. And the one thing that kind of continues to be at the forefront of dealing with helping children to make friends is one, that you can't force it. And I actually was looking this up because I'd heard that many times over. I'd seen it in the literature in the past, and it still seems to be true. Don't force it. But there's a nuance to it, and that is you do take advantage of interactive situations. So it's not an avoidance thing. It's not, when we say don't force it, it doesn't mean avoid it. Take advantage of situations that are interactive and do require kids to come together in some meaningful way. And that can result in then trying different situations, even if those situations put your child a little bit out of their comfort zone. Because oftentimes what we see is that if you can align opportunities to interact with their interests, again, it's that peer group, you increase the chance of finding like-minded peers and increase the chance of building that support network. Many, many times over, we've heard a parent say, oh, I'm nervous about sending my child to CTY because they don't make friends easily. And almost without fail, those students come back with at least having developed some relationships, and often, very strongly. So I would always say to someone who says my child has trouble making friends, be kind of careful and be diligent about putting them in situations where they're likely to have that opportunity. And in many cases, we want to watch for those fairly low stakes. And then I think the other piece of this that is related to that is be supportive, but step back, meaning that this gets back to the don't force it. Our job as parents is often to kind of be there for our children, and particularly in a social situation where you're trying to see if relationships can develop, we do as adults need to kind of let it happen and step back. And what we find in many cases, and this is supported by the literature, is that peers will find each other in time and with the right circumstances. So again, really providing those opportunities for kids to interact with other students is often the way to get them there. And then the last area I want to talk about with respect to building your authentic story is the empowering of self-advocacy. And this one gets a little touchy for some people, including me occasionally, because our parental instinct is to protect our children at all costs. And I would still argue you have to do that from a safety sense. But when it comes to their activities, their interests, their education, this instinct is to kind of clear the way. It's to take care of the obstacles, and it's to be the one that actually finds the opportunities and solutions for our children. And there are all kinds of names for parents. We call parents helicopter parents or snowplow parents, the idea that we're clearing the way for our children. We need to fight that. And in fact, what I would argue is that we need to shift the mindset from being a snowplow to being a safety net. And the idea here is that we need to help students understand obstacles and opportunities, think about them in light of what's in their control, what's not, and then what decisions might need to be made. And so the goal should not be to clear the obstacles and create opportunities specifically, but to help our children develop the life skills to manage obstacles themselves and empower them to find opportunities. And somebody said the other day, well, you must be talking about high school. No, I'm talking about as early as elementary school. And I think there are two elements to this empowering of self-advocacy, probably more, but I break it down into sort of two areas that I think we can think about as parents and educators. And the first is helping kids learn to make choices. And this comes down to, I've talked a lot about, finding things you're interested in and following your passions, getting into things. But the reality is kids cannot and should not try to do everything. This gets back to that notion of there is no magical checklist that says if you do all these things, then you're going to be successful. Kids have to make choices, and we often make those choices for them. And one thing we can do in terms of empowering children is to help them evaluate priorities, help them think about which activities mean the most to them, which activities support their goals. So sometimes those are contradictory, meaning that there may be activities that a child's going, well, that's not the most interesting thing I could do right now, but doing that would actually get them to the next stage of something they do want to do. And so helping them evaluate those priorities and understand what has to be done. So what am I just going to have to do? And then of the things that I can do and have some more control over, why would I want to do certain ones over others? And then allow age-appropriate decision-making. So even young children can make some decisions. Now, I'm not going to suggest that you let an 8-year-old decide whether they're going to school today or not. Of course not. However, if you're talking about something like doing, say, a summer program, it may be that you don't let the child decide that they will or will not, because it may be the case that, we know about summer learning loss. We know that for advanced learners in particular, they really enjoy doing things through the summer in many cases. But it might be that you put the decision about which kind of program or which courses in the hands of a younger child. As they age up, you might actually allow decisions about whether or not to do those kinds of things. And then support their choices, whether you agree or not, meaning that with the exception of things that you know are going to be truly devastating, allowing them to make the choice. You've decided it's an age-appropriate decision for them to make. You then agree with, whether you agree or not, you support that decision. In leadership, we call that the disagree and commit model. As a parent, I find it a very difficult one. And then help them reflect on those choices. So that, again, much like some of the other things, that reflection piece, saying like, why did you choose that, is important. And this is where mistakes may happen. Someone may choose to do an activity or pick between different things and decide later, oh, kind of wish I'd gone the other way. That's okay. We've all been there. And mistakes are going to happen, and those should be viewed as opportunities to learn. Again, now that takes us back to that failure to choose an opportunity, failure to do something may result in a change in the way that they're operating, but it would also then provide a chance to say, I've learned something. I can reflect on that and say, oh, confronted with that next time, I might make a different choice. So that's learning to make choices. The other side of advocacy is, I think, what people think of as sort of strong advocating, and that is helping children to be a voice for their own education. And what I would suggest here is that in my experience, children are the best advocates for their own needs with your support. And I've seen this in many cases where if a student is raising an issue that, for something that they feel they need for themselves, for their classroom, that is often received as more genuine. Because there's always a question when it's a parent driving it of wanting to know, how much is this about the student or how much is this about the parent? So when you can, empowering your child to be the advocate is a strong way to go. And the way I think about this is when a question or a problem or an issue emerges, ask yourself, what is your threshold for getting involved? And I'm going to share with you the way I actually deal with this and have dealt with this as a parent. And I urge others to do this. And the first is I ask myself, is it sensitive and or urgent? So if it is truly about safety or issues that are more adult in nature, or it's something so immediate that it has to be taken care of right now, yeah, that might require immediate parental intervention. However, if it's something more in the classroom space, less sort of overall sensitive like issue, or it's not of immediate urgency, my next question is, did my child make a clear effort to resolve the situation? And if the answer is a very clear yes, they tried to make an effort and they're not getting anywhere, then maybe it's time for parental intervention. But if they haven't, or I think maybe they could try harder, then it's an opportunity to consider whether this is a teachable moment for my child to advocate, or potentially to work with me to advocate for whatever it is the issue is. So I actually had to lay this out for myself as a parent so that I would remind myself not to just jump in when something was going wrong, and really, really think about that, letting a child advocate for themselves. Now, when we talk about being a voice for their own education, there is a caveat to it. And that is that being empowered does not mean that they're on their own. This gets back to that notion of safety net. And I would actually argue you're a cheerleader and a safety net. So they must know that you are encouraging and that you are there to help them navigate this space. And then they must know that you are the safety net. And then I would argue that over time, your role in this as a safety net and as a cheerleader will probably become less visible. I would argue it never goes away. I mean, anyone who's a parent knows that you're always there to be your child's safety net, but the actual role you play over time can be less and less visible as a child becomes a better advocate for themselves. And the really exciting bonus to this that we've seen in these spaces, and that the literature bears out, is that once a student can advocate for themselves, then they can also advocate for others, and often will. So in addition to providing them with the tools, they can carry that forward and help others to do the same. So it's provides that sort of good citizenship piece as well. Okay, so I want to wrap up by just saying the take-home messages here are fairly straightforward from what we've talked about. It's really just kind of a recap of what we hit on. So I think I will just plug once again that you want to avoid those college admissions myths that are out there, because I think we focus too heavily on college admissions and not enough on the fact that just success itself does lead to those kinds of things being advantageous. And really, the focus needs to be on fostering a child's growth and learning. We talked about several different areas within that, and that I hope overall having these kinds of things front and center for you will help you to think about the fact that as a parent, you're doing the bulk of it already by just being engaged in your child's education. And so if you can keep calm and enjoy the journey, both you and your child will have some advantages, because reality is if you are anxious about these things, that anxiety will transfer. And being anxious is not a particularly helpful way to get through any of this. So keep calm, enjoy the journey. And with that, I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us. And we do have all kinds of things going on at CTY. I have a little code here because we are actually, we have some virtual events coming up where we're going to celebrate 45 years of CTY with sharing some of the things that we're up to. But also, I hope that we'll see you in programs and activities throughout the year. And with that, I will pass it back over to Stacy.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was fantastic. Let me go ahead and stop the recording.